Okay, welcome to the watercolor tutorial. So the first thing I need you to do is open up your sketchbook to a fresh page, and you can decide to pull this out and glue it in later. You can leave it as is, or you can kind of open up your sketchbook like this and leave the one page that we're going to work with off to the side so that nothing else gets wet. Okay. I'm going to need you to set up your page something like this. Now you can do a grid, or maybe you want to do it on a separate page and then cut them out and stick them in as samples. That's fine too. But these are the following that I need you to do. So I'm going to walk through this, and then I want you to kind of pause the video and set up your sketchbook. Okay. So the first thing we have is bruise, and notice that I have like a little box. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Could be a circle or a box, could be a grid layout, however you like to organize your book. So bruise is the first one. Water blossom, wash, gradiated or gradated wash, wet on wet or color bleed, variated wash, lifting, spatter, wet on wet, and stencil. Okay, so take a moment, pause the video where it's at, and set up your sketchbook so it looks something like this. All right, so once you've paused and set up your sketchbook, we're gonna go ahead and start watercoloring. So you have a watercolor palette like this, and this one's kind of messy, but hopefully I set it just like that so that you can see. You need a paper towel. Okay, you have a brown paper towel in class. You're gonna need your two paintbrushes, which are, these are kind of old and gunky, but this one is a flat, and then you have like a round brush. And then you'll need a little water cup of water. So I have mine right here, okay? The first thing, and you can also use your round watercolor palette, which is a paint palette and has wells, so it's often called a well palette. It's the circle with the wells in it, the little bumps out. And so those are fun for mixing colors. And then also you can mix colors right here in this paint set here. This is a paint pan. You can use it in the lid or whatever, but I would suggest taking a wet or damp paper towel when you're finished and just kind of cleaning that out for the next person. Okay, so I'm gonna go over how to actually load your brush and use the watercolors, and then we'll go on to each one of these pieces. So I'll want you to follow along and do this with me. So again, you might have to pause the video, rewind the video, etc. while you're working, but that's, you should be doing this alongside me, okay? All right, so I have my two brushes, and it doesn't matter to me which one you use. You can try both or either. As we're working, I'm going to use the flat one to start with. And this currently is a dry brush. Now, if I just take my dry brush and try to go into my dry paint, nothing's going to happen. And so I'm going to wet my brush. And this also prepares my, my brush really to accept paint, right? So I'm going to take my wet brush, and I'm going to kind of take the side and wipe it on the edge so that any excess comes off. And I'm going to choose a color, because here it doesn't matter. And I'm going to gently activate the paint. So I'm taking my damp brush and I'm placing it into the paint well here, or the paint pan, and then gently activating the paint. I'm not shoving my brush in, I'm not twisting my brush. That'll ruin my brush, my bristles, and also my paint pan. So I'm just basically waking up the color with some water, and you can see that by taking it then over to the lid, and you can see the paint that's there. If I put some more water on my brush and bring it over to that area, I'm gonna have a lighter value. Okay, so if I actually just take my brush and go on the side and I put my paint down right there, I'll have one value. And value, we haven't really talked about, but value is the lightness and darkness of a color or black and white, right? So, which would really be grayscale, not really white. But anyway, so if I add more water, the more water I add to it, the lighter the value of the paint, right? So we don't actually have white paint for our watercolors. Watercolor starts with a white base of paper, and then we darken it by adding more color values, okay? So I can actually make it a little bit darker here, and I can add more white or more water here and make it lighter on the side so you can kind of see, okay? So that's the first step. So once I've woken up my paint, what I want to do is come on over to Bruise, okay? So I'm going to come over to Bruise and I'm going to take my paint, and Bruise is actually something we don't want to do. And so I want to point out what it kind of looks like. So if I paint my color right there, and then I kind of overwork, is what it's called, overworking the space. Like, oh, I don't like that. I want to make it darker. I'm going to add more paint. And I'm just going to go back and forth and really rub my paper. What starts to happen is that the paper starts pilling up. You can see those little dots that are kind of happening, and ruins the paper. I can also scratch into the paper because it's wet. It's very vulnerable. And notice that when I scratch into it, the paint is falling into those areas. If I take my pencil and draw in there as well, that has dented the paper too, and I can't go back and erase that. It will always be there, okay? So that's what happens when we overwork or work on a watercolor section that is wet. So watercolor is tricky. We're just going through the basics now, but I want you to understand how that works. What we don't want is to bruise our paper, okay? Anytime I want to change my colors, I need to go back to my water, and I'm going to swish it around. My bristles, swish them in the water, and then kind of tap off the side or pull the water off the side so that I don't have a ton there. All right, so water blossom can be a really beautiful thing, but also it can be a dangerous thing. So I want to show you what that looks like too. So if I take my water and I'm placing it onto my little square here, and then I take my paint and load it on my brush. This is a loaded brush. When it has paint or water, it's called a loaded brush. And then I can kind of really make some really beautiful blooms. And so that's the blossoming part. But what can happen is that once I do that, a lot of times we think, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and I need to fix that. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to add some more paint to that. And so I add more paint in here. And what's going to happen is that paint is going to go out, kind of blossom out and create some ridges around. Now, again, this might be a really beautiful technique that you want, but generally speaking, if I am creating something and I want to make a nice big area of color, I don't really want any of those blossoms. And so this is not really kind of showing what I want it to show, but basically it'll leave edges where the paint is. Let's see if I can get it to do it over time. Okay, so hopefully I can show you that in just a little bit. The wash is one of our most useful techniques, and this can be really hard when we're doing a very large area. Now I'm just doing a small area, so it's going to be really easy and you'll have a lot of success as well. But when you're doing a large piece of paper, you're going to want a larger brush to kind of cover that area. So if I take my brush and I put some water on it, I want to prepare my paper by placing some water down, not a ton. I don't want it to be soaking. I don't want it to pool, but I do want my paper to be ready to accept some paint. So I'm going to lift up some paint from my palette, and I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to pull my paint down, okay? So you'll notice that what's created is like this bead of paint here on the end. And so what I'm doing is actually taking that bead and I'm pulling it back and forth down my paper. Okay, so I should get a nice even wash with that. If my paper starts to dry, I need to let it dry the whole way. And that's where I'm gonna get some water blossoming too if I try to go back and add when it's already dry. Or I might bruise my paper. All right, the next one is called a gradated wash. So I'm going to take, again, load my brush with some paint, or actually, I'm sorry, some water. And I'm going to just do, again, a nice little gentle brush over it so that it accepts my paint very well. I'm going to load my paintbrush with some paint, and I'm going to start at the top, and I'm going to start pulling down. But you'll notice what's going to happen is it's going to create a wash, and I don't want it to. I actually want it to get lighter in value as I go. So I'm going to take some water, and I'm going to start pulling that down as well. So I can start at the top and pull that down. Okay, again, I can load my brush, get a little darker at the top, and I can pull it down. I can take a thirsty brush, so that's when I dry off my brush. I can take a thirsty brush and start at the bottom and kind of lift some of that up as well as I go, and that will make it a little bit lighter at the bottom. I like thirsty brushes. They kind of help kind of clean things up for us. Okay, so it gets darker at the top and lighter towards the bottom. All right, wet on wet is one of my favorite techniques because it's really fun to use. And so this is, again, you'll want to get water on your brush and kind of, again, prepare your paper for the paint. Again, not pooling water, so I have a little too much. I'm going to go ahead and pull some of that up with a thirsty brush. Okay, and then I'm going to take my paint and I'm going to let it do the blossoming, but kind of in a fun, beautiful way. I can also take another color. Let's say I want to take some green and I want to add that in there, and I can let that kind of play in as well. And I can take more water and I can kind of let it pool. Now, if you know anything about color theory, which we're going to get into a little bit later, if you have colors that are opposite on the color wheel, they're called complementary. And you can think of Christmas colors, for example, or sports team colors, for example. So red and green are complementary. Orange and blue are complementary, like the Chicago Bears. If you were to use those two, they're really beautiful together, but they also, when they mix, become brown. So they become a more muddied brown. So a varied wash is very similar to the gradated wash or the regular wash. And so I'm going to start by placing my color, or excuse me, my water down on my paper, preparing my paper for paint. Take my color, start at the top. Again, just like a wash, I'm just pulling it down. And then I'm going to wash my brush and get my other color, and I'm going to start at the bottom and go up. And so this is kind of where they start to mix in between to make this really beautiful wash of color in between, like a blue-green. In between. Okay. All right, lifting is kind of one of my favorites too. And so this is, again, you can go ahead and try doing dry brushing onto, oh, that's another technique we should do actually. I'm going to add that in, dry brushing. Let's see if I can fit it in the bottom. I think we can fit it in. It's kind of similar to stencil, so we'll get there. Okay, so lifting, if I'm taking my paint, placing it down. Ooh, look at that beautiful blossom. Ooh, so beautiful. Our color blade. Lifting is taking a thirsty brush and pulling it up. So I'm pulling, wiping. Pulling, wiping. And I might want a specific area to have it more lighter or lift it up, so I'm going to pull that up in that one particular area. I can also take a piece of my paper towel and kind of sop it up that way too, and that creates some interesting textures. okay? Now spatter, what I'm gonna have you do is take some, a wet or a damp brush, loaded brush, and I'm going to have you just do half of that square with water. The other half I want dry. And what we're gonna do is take our color, we're gonna load it on our brush, and spattering is not like flinging the paint. What it is taking a rigid hand and a loaded brush. And if you know anything about percussion, you're gonna take the edge and let it kind of bounce off of your rigid finger, okay? So I'm just bouncing it off of that. And so the reason why I have you doing this with dry and wet is to see what happens. So when I spatter on the wet, you can see that the watercolor is blossoming, and on the dry, it's going to dry and leave a very clean spatter. So that's a really fun one to do to get some interesting texture. You got to be careful about everybody around you so that you're not spattering on other people's work. So if you're spattering, let them know. But you can see how I still got it pretty controlled in just this area by tapping on this one area. So if I go nuts on it, it's going to spatter all over, right? But if I have a rigid hand and again a flexible, it's kind of like a loose grip here, you can see how my brush is kind of wobbly, and then bounce it on my hand, you can see how I'm spattering in a more controlled way. So right, it does get in other areas, but not all over the place. Okay, wet on dry. So I'm gonna go ahead and get a dry, or I'm gonna go ahead and glaze wash a little area here. And I'm gonna let that dry because we're gonna come back to it. Oh, here's an example of a water blossom. Here's a perfect example. So I had made this little wash and then I just dropped some water and now it's left a little mark. And if I go to clean that up, it's going to leave a very clear little area here. You can see it. So you got to be really careful when it comes to watercolors because you can't really set that back up. You have to wait for it to dry and then you can go back in and try to add a little layer right there. All right, so dry brush is literally taking a dry piece of paper and a drier brush, and so I'll do it with the green here, and you can kind of see how I can make some interesting textures with my slightly drier brush, right? So I can go back in, clean my brush, dry it off, use some of my blue that I've got here, and I can do the same kind of dry brush. So that's the dry brush. Okay, and lastly, stencil is a real fun one. Oh, and we'll come back to the wet on dry, excuse me. But stencil's a real fun one because I can take a shape or something that I've cut out and I can place it. And like if I have stencils of shapes or letters, they're really fun to do. I can take a drier brush and I can take my brush and kind of start at the stencil and kind of pull outward. And then it creates a really nice line here. So I can wait for that to dry if I want to, and then go back with another color. And just keep on creating interesting patterns or textures using that. So let's see if it'll dry a little bit. We can come back and do more stencil. All right, so my wet on dry, this is a little bit still damp, but the idea behind this is I can go back over. Let's use my round brush. And I can add some details on top, which is like doing some interesting glazing or some mark making on top of my color. And what's great about watercolors is that they are translucent, and so you can see through again, the more color you have, the more water you have, the more translucent or transparent they're going to be, right? So this is more opaque right here, but if I add more water, I can see through it and create some interest. So again, if I have my stencil, I can go back with my paint and create some interesting dynamics going on here. Okay. Okay, lastly, when we are totally done with everything, first of all, you never want to leave your brush like I just had. I just left it right in here. In fact, this little cup that I have, which is my favorite, you basically wipe off your brush, and it's got ridges to hold your paintbrush to remind you that you should never keep your bristles down in your water. And what happens, this is called the flag, and what happens, the flag on your bristles will start to bend because of the pressure of the brush in the water. And when you pull it out, it will stay that shape. It'll stay a bent shape. So when you actually go to use it, it will not be really usable for you, and it'll be really frustrating. So instead, always want to wash your brush and then leave it flat on your table or on something that is going to absorb some of the water, like a paper towel or something like that. Okay, so I'm going to wash my brush really well, and I'm going to go to the sink, and I can wash it one more time. You don't need soap with watercolor. The cool thing about watercolors is that when this dries out, you'll still get to reactivate it with water, unlike other paints like acrylic or house paint, like latex paint that you might have used before. Once you use it and it dries out, it's ruined or it's done, right? So you can't reactivate it and use it. But watercolors is really cool because you can reactivate this. So what I'm asking you to do is to please take a damp paper towel and kind of wipe out the lid or the palette area here. Make sure that's nice and clean. And then leave the palette open on the table like this. Do not close it up because we don't want to have this kind of mold or mildew over. We're just gonna leave it open to dry out. Your brushes, you can kind of dry out the best you can. And you can also reshape them kind of gently with your fingers like this. Pulling from the ferrule, that's this part here, it's called the ferrule. And if your sketchbook is still wet at the end of the period, you can leave it in the drying rack. So you just place it in one of those grid areas and leave it there overnight, and tomorrow you can pick it up and grab it. Make sure you wash out your water cup, put away your paintbrushes, and you should be good to go. And throw away your paper towels, right? Of course, clean up your mess. If there's anything on your tabletop, make sure to take a damp paper towel and just do a quick wipe of your whole area. It's always nice to reinforce a clean area for the next class. All right, let me know in class if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to help you.